In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and an enemy that does not care about you. Not angry, not cruel. Cruelty has a face. Cruelty gets tired. They are eating, and you happen to be standing on the food. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Corporal Hadren Mossik, 163rd Immerbeck Line Infantry. He had the stripe 19 weeks before shipping out, inherited from a man discharged in pieces. 4 men under him. By the end of the 5th week, he had none, and nobody gave him more, because there were none to give. Somebody should say what happened on Grenthar, and everyone whose job that was is dead. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first thing you need to understand about Tyranids is that they do not care about you. I know that sounds obvious. I know every soldier in the Astra Militarum has heard some version of that speech from some officer who has never seen one up close. And I know you are probably already thinking you know what I mean. You do not. You are thinking of an enemy that hates you, or an enemy that wants something from you, or an enemy that has some purpose you can push back against. The Tyranids do not have any of those things. They are not angry. They are not cruel. They are eating, and you happen to be standing on the food. Cruelty has a face. Cruelty gets tired. Hunger does not. Somebody should say what happened on Grenthar, and the people whose job that was are dead. If I do not say it now, the details are going to start sliding around in my head until they stop making sense. Some of them already have. Some of them never did. My name is Hadren Mossik, Corporal 163rd Immerbeck Line Infantry. Was a corporal. Might still be, technically. I have not checked. I had the stripe for 19 weeks before we shipped, which is not long enough to learn anything. And it came to me because the man who had it before put his hand into a running loader chain on a training range and was discharged in pieces. 4 men. That is what a corporal has. Vesht, Hanfeld, Senek, and a boy called Caro, who I am ashamed to say I cannot picture anymore. By the end of the 5th week, I had none, and nobody gave me more because there were none to give. I kept the rank and stopped having the job, which is the standard arrangement in the Astra Militarum and has never been thought worth a form. The Munitorum tends to lag behind reality by about 6 months on a good day, and reality has been moving fast lately, and I do not think anyone in the Departamento has caught up to the fact that the 163rd does not exist anymore in any sense that matters. On paper, somewhere, there is a regiment. On Grenthar, there is mulch. We shipped out from the Velask transit depot on the 31st day of an embarkation cycle that had been running for 2 months. They loaded us the way you load anything that has to go somewhere and does not need to arrive in any particular condition, which I noticed because loading is what I did before the Munitorum found me, and a man who has spent 9 years stacking freight can tell you within about 4 seconds whether a hold has been packed by someone who expects to unpack it. Nobody told us where we were going, which was normal. Nobody told us what we would be fighting, which was also normal. What was not normal was the mood of the naval officers on the transport. I have been on 4 combat transports in my service career, and I have never once seen a naval officer look worried. Bored? Yes. Contemptuous? Frequently. But on the solemn admonition, the officers were moving too fast between decks and not making eye contact. And I noticed it because I notice things when people stop acting the way they are supposed to act. And I wish I did not, because noticing things has never once made my life better. We found out about the Tyranids 9 days before planetfall, not from a briefing. From the ship's astropath dying. She screamed for 11 hours. I know that because our berthing deck was 3 levels below the astropathic choir chamber, and we could hear her through the hull. And after the first hour, people stopped talking, and after the third hour, people stopped pretending they could not hear it. And by the 7th hour, someone in 2nd Platoon had wedged a blanket into the ventilation grill because the sound was coming through the air recyclers, and it did not help. By the 11th hour, she was not screaming anymore. She was making a sound I do not have a word for, something between choking and singing, and then she stopped. The ship's commissar told us the next morning that the astropath had suffered a navigational episode. Nobody asked questions. Nobody needed to. Every man on that deck knew what kills an astropath from the inside, because every man on that deck had heard the primer passages about the shadow in the warp, and every man on that deck had assumed those passages were exaggerated. They were not exaggerated. If anything, the primer undersells it. Grenthar is a hive world, was a hive world. I need to stop doing that, switching between tenses, but it is hard because part of me keeps insisting the place is still there, still turning, still doing whatever a planet does when there is nothing alive on it anymore. And technically that is true. The rock is still there. Everything that made it Grenthar is not. 600 million people across 3 hive cities, and a subsurface agri network that fed a quarter of the Velask subsector, and an orbital station that processed shipping for 9 neighboring systems. That was Grenthar. 3 hive cities. Drossenmarch in the north, Convelden in the mid-latitudes, and a smaller one in the southern reaches called Palenstoke that I never saw and never will. Canvelden fell before we arrived. Palenstoke fell while we were in transit. We did not know that at the time. We found out when we made orbit, and the tactical overlay showed 2 of the 3 hive designators in red and the 3rd in amber, and our transport captain started swearing in a dialect I did not recognize, and the ship went to general quarters, and we dropped inside 4 hours. 4 hours. Standard deployment protocol calls for 72 hours of orbital survey before a contested world insertion. We got 4. That should have told me everything I needed to know about how bad it was, but I was too busy trying to keep my kit together in a drop run that was shaking so hard the overhead panels were coming loose. The solemn admonition did not stay. She put us down, broke orbit inside the hour, and translated out before the last of our vehicles was off the pad, and I thought at the time it was cowardice. A mid-class transport in a system with a hive fleet feeding in it is a hold full of biomass with engines attached. For 43 days after that, there was nothing above us at all. Drossenmarch, the last hive standing. There was a briefing on the way down. 40 seconds of it, shouted over the engines by a lieutenant I never saw again, and the substance was this. The tendril consuming Grenthar would move on when Grenthar was finished, and the next system along the line was Corvin Hall, which has 4 inhabited worlds and a naval yard, and every week Drossenmarch held was a week the tendril spent here instead of there. It is not stupid. A hive fleet feeds until a world is empty and then it moves. You cannot beat it. You can make the meal take longer. 2,000 men were shipped across a subsector to be the part of the meal that chews slowly. The lieutenant did not use those words. Everyone in that compartment worked it out somewhere over the second minute. What it looked like from the air I only got through a 10-centimeter slit in the hull of a Valkyrie that was pulling evasive maneuvers hard enough to make me lose my breakfast. And what I could see in the half-seconds when the slit lined up with the ground was this. Brown. Everything was brown. Not the brown of soil or the brown of rust or the brown of anything I had a name for. A wet, living brown, like the skin of something that had been peeled. The landscape between the hive walls and the horizon was covered in it. Kilometers of it. and it was moving. Not fast, not like an army, more like the way water moves when you pour it onto a flat surface, a slow, creeping expansion in every direction at once. And I remember thinking it looked like it was growing. And then the Valkyrie banked and I lost the angle, and Trooper Sinek threw up on my boots, and I had other problems for a while. We landed inside the Hive perimeter. They had cleared a section of the outer industrial district for a landing zone, which meant they had demolished 6 city blocks and scraped the rubble into berms, and it still was not big enough for all the transports coming down. So 3 Valkyries set down in what used to be somebody's habitation block, and we climbed out over the wreckage of what had been somebody's home. Whoever sized that zone had worked from the manifest of what was supposed to arrive rather than from what was actually inbound, and those 2 figures have never matched anywhere in the Imperium. I remember there was a children's toy in the rubble, one of those stamped tin Aquila things they sell at Ministorum feast days, and I picked it up without thinking and then put it back because I did not know what I was going to do with it. And I was standing in a war zone, and a sergeant I had never met was screaming at us to form up. The air was wrong. That was the first thing. Not the smell, although the smell was its own problem, a thick biological stink like rotting vegetation and something sweeter underneath that I could not identify and did not want to. The air itself felt wrong, heavy, damp, like breathing through a cloth that someone had left in standing water. That was the spores. Tyranid organisms shed them constantly, billions at a time, and after a few weeks of a tendril working a planet, the atmosphere is saturated. They do not infect you. They coat your lungs. They coat everything. After 3 days on Grenthar, the inside of my last gun's barrel was filled with something that looked like pale mold, and I had to clean it every 4 hours or the focusing array would drift. After a week, I stopped noticing the taste in the back of my throat. After 2 weeks, I could not remember what clean air felt like. The garrison commander of Drossenmarch was a colonel named Treskova. She was also, by the 4th week, the government. Grenthar had a planetary governor, and he had been in Convelden when Convelden fell, along with the whole apparatus that governs a world. The tithe office, the administratum staff, the judges, the man whose signature makes a thing lawful. None of it came north. What arrived in Drossenmarch was refugees and a silence where a planetary authority used to be. After 2 weeks of sending requests to an office that no longer existed, Treskova stopped sending them and started signing things herself. Nobody appointed her. Nobody could have. If Grenthar had lived, somebody would have had to decide whether that was a promotion or an offense. I never met her personally. I saw her once, on the 2nd day, walking the forward line with 2 adjutants and a bodyguard detail out of her own veteran company, older men, the kind a planetary defense force keeps for parades and then discovers it needs. And she looked like she had not slept in a month, which was close enough to accurate. Treskova had been running the defense of Grenthar since the first spore pods hit Convelden, and by the time we showed up, she had lost 2/3 of the planetary defense force, all contact with subsector command, and her entire astropathic choir. That last part is not the disaster it would have been in my grandfather's service. Nothing has reached anywhere reliably since the rift opened. You send, and the sending goes into whatever the sky has become, and sometimes a thing arrives 13 months later at a world that no longer needs it, and the Munitorum has stopped apologizing for this because there is nobody left to apologize to. She was commanding the last hive on a world that was being eaten alive, with no reinforcements confirmed, and no communication with anyone beyond low-orbit Vox range, and she was still standing upright and giving orders, and it frightened me. A person goes through that and keeps functioning by making some arrangement on the inside, and I did not want to know what hers was. We were assigned to the northeastern perimeter, Sector 14. The hive wall in Sector 14 was about 90 meters tall, which sounds like a lot until you see what is on the other side of it, and then it sounds like nothing. Our section of wall had been reinforced with rockcrete and plasteel buttressing by the engineers who had been there before us, and it had firing positions every 12 meters and heavy weapon emplacements every 60, and it looked like a proper fortification, like something out of a Tactica primer, and I thought, all right, this is defensible. We can hold this. Then I climbed the wall and looked over the parapet, and I stopped thinking that. The ground outside the wall was alive. That is not a metaphor. The brown carpet I had seen from the air was a mass of organisms so dense that there was no visible ground beneath them. Ripper swarms, mostly, millions of them, each one about the size of a man's forearm, and they moved in patterns that looked random until you watched long enough and realized they were not random at all. They were circulating the way blood circulates, and the landscape was their body. Between the rippers were larger forms, termagants in clusters of 40 or 50, standing motionless, their weapons arms hanging at their sides like they were waiting for something. Hormagaunts, in long rows that stretched back toward the horizon, still as statues. Warriors, taller, broader, each one the height of 2 men, spaced at regular intervals like officers overseeing a parade ground. And behind all of that, in the haze where the spore-thickened air turned everything into shadows, larger shapes, much larger, things that moved slowly because they did not need to move fast, things that made the ground shake when they shifted their weight, and I could feel it through the wall, through 90 meters of Hive City foundation. A rhythmic vibration like a heartbeat that was not mine. Nobody was shooting. Our entire section of wall was manned, hundreds of soldiers, guns loaded, heavy bolters charged, and nobody was firing because the Tyranids were not attacking. They were just there, waiting. And the soldiers who had been on the wall before us, the ones from the Grenthar Planetary Defense Force who had been watching this for weeks, they were not even looking over the parapet anymore. They sat with their backs to the wall, faces blank, and when I asked one of them why nobody was shooting, he looked at me like I had asked why nobody was punching the ocean. He said, "They come when they want to come. Save your ammunition." I did not understand what he meant. I would. It was not as smooth between us and them as I have made it sound. A planetary defense force has been on its own world its whole life, and a guard regiment arrives off a ship, and the first thing the guard regiment does is look at the state of the line and form a view. We formed a view. Within a day, there were men in my company saying that Drossenmarch would have held Convelden if the locals had been worth anything, which was said by people who had been on the planet for 19 hours. And they had their own version, which I only got much later from Orven, and which was that 2,000 off-worlders had turned up to defend a city they could not name a district of, would be gone inside a month, one way or another, and were eating rations that had been counted for people whose families were behind the wall. Both of those are true, which is the part I did not understand at the time. It thinned out, and not through anybody's goodwill. After the second week, both groups had the same casualty rate, the same water, and the same nightmare. By the 5th week, nobody used the word local as an insult, or as anything else, because there were not enough of either of us left to make a category out of. The first attack came on our 3rd night. I say night because the chronos said it was night. You could not tell from the sky. The spore coverage was so thick by that point that Grenthar did not have day and night anymore, just slightly brighter murk and slightly darker murk. And in the darker murk, somewhere around 3 in the morning local time, the wall sensors started screaming. I would like to say I grabbed my last gun and moved to my position like the soldier I was trained to be. What I actually did was fall off my cot, spend 4 seconds trying to remember where I was, spend another 2 seconds trying to get my boots on the wrong feet, and then run to the wall in a state of confused terror, which makes you move fast and in circles at the same time, and arrive at your firing position out of breath with your boots on the wrong feet and your webbing twisted sideways, and your hands shaking so badly that it takes you 3 attempts to get your last gun's power cells seated. Then I looked over the wall and the shaking stopped, because something in my brain decided that if I was going to die, I was not going to die shaking, and switched off the part that was responsible for it, and I have never been able to switch it back on. I think it broke. I think there is a mechanism in the human brain that handles fear, and mine cracked that night, like an overstressed bearing, and now it just spins freely and does not engage with anything. And I do not know if that makes me brave or damaged, and I do not care. The Ripper carpet was moving. All of it, everywhere, the entire visible landscape, shifting toward the wall in a single wave, and riding on top of the Rippers like boats on a current were the assault organisms, Hormagaunts, by the thousand, and they were fast. Faster than anything that size should be, a sprinting gallop that covered ground so quickly that by the time I had processed what I was looking at, the first wave had already crossed half the distance to the wall. Behind them, the termagants opened fire. Flesh borers, a biological ranged weapon that fires a beetle, and I know how that sounds. I know it sounds absurd, a gun that shoots a bug. And I thought the same thing when I read the primer entry, and then a flesh borer round hit the rock crete 2 meters from my head, and the beetle burrowed into the wall to the depth of my fist in about 1.5 seconds, and then detonated. And suddenly it did not sound absurd anymore. The wall lit up. Every weapon we had opened at once. Las guns, heavy bolters, autocannons, the 2 Lehman Russ battle tanks that were dug in behind our section, and the noise stopped being noise and became a pressure against my chest, and everyone was firing, and I watched the front rank of Hormagaunts dissolve. That is the right word, dissolve. Las fire and bolt rounds and autocannon shells ripping through chitin, and the things coming apart in sprays of fluid that was not blood, not exactly, something thicker and hotter and a color I do not want to describe. And for maybe 30 seconds I thought, we are killing them. We are actually killing them. This is working. Then the second wave arrived, running over the bodies of the first, and I realized the first wave had not been an attack. It had been a measurement. 1,000 Hormagaunts sent at the wall to see where we would shoot, how fast we would react, what weapons we had, and where. 1,000 organisms dead in half a minute, and now it knew everything about us. The second wave was different. The Hormagaunts did not charge in a line. They spread, they dispersed, they came at the wall in groups of 5 or 6, moving at different speeds and different angles, and suddenly the heavy bolters that had been so effective 30 seconds ago were tracking back and forth and not landing on anything long enough to matter. The termagant fire shifted from the wall to the weapon emplacements, specifically, precisely, every flesh bore round aimed at the heavy bolters and the autocannons, as if someone had drawn them a map. And I watched Gunner Feskin take a round through the firing slit that hit his loader in the throat, and a round that should not have been able to find an angle like that through a 10-centimeter gap in reinforced plasteel, and it found it. They learn. That is the thing the primers do not emphasize enough, and if they emphasized it properly, nobody would ever agree to fight them. The Tyranids learn. Not the individual organisms, the hive mind. It watches, it processes, it adapts. And it does this in real time, in the middle of a battle, faster than any command structure I have ever seen. An orc keeps coming at you the same way. An orc is an orc, and it has one approach to every problem. A heretic keeps changing tactics, since heretics are humans, and humans have imaginations. A Tyranid does something worse. It looks at your defenses and becomes the exact shape that fits through the gaps. The first night cost us 43 men, out of roughly 600 in our section, 7%, which does not sound like much until you consider that we killed thousands of them and lost 43, and the exchange rate was meaningless because they had more thousands, and we did not have more men. In the morning, if you can call it morning, the organisms withdrew. Not a retreat, a withdrawal. Orderly, synchronized. Every organism on the field turning and moving away from the wall at exactly the same moment as if someone had flipped a switch. And the silence that followed was worse than the attack, because during the attack you were doing something. You were fighting. You had a purpose. And in the silence you had nothing but the memory of what had just happened and the knowledge that it was going to happen again. And there was nothing you could do between now and then except sit behind a wall that suddenly felt very, very thin. I cleaned my last gun. I cleaned it 3 times. I checked my ammunition. I checked it twice. I ate a ration bar that tasted like processed cardboard and drank water that tasted like the inside of a recycler tank, which it was, because the Hive's water infrastructure was already showing strain, and the stuff coming out of the taps had a yellowish tint that nobody wanted to talk about. Then I sat with my back to the wall like the Planetary Defense Force troopers I had judged 3 days ago, and I understood why they were not looking over the parapet. Because once you have seen what is on the other side, you do not want to see it again until you have to. Trooper Hanfeld found me first. Hanfeld was in my squad, a long-faced man who talked constantly about his mother's cooking, a specific grain porridge that was apparently famous in his hab block, and he could describe this porridge for 20 minutes without taking a breath, and I found it maddening under normal circumstances, and on that morning after the first attack, it was the most comforting sound in the world. He dropped onto the firing step beside me and said, "My mother puts 6 kinds of salt in her porridge, and each one goes in at a different temperature, or the grain does not open properly." And I listened to him talk about salt for 10 minutes, and it helped more than anything the medici could have given me. Then Sergeant Corvan found us both. Corvan was my squad leader, a compact woman from the Immerbeck northern reaches with a voice like a bolt-action cycling, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that any situation was as bad as it clearly was. Not bad for a first go, she said, and did not sit down, because she never sat down. 43 men are dead, I said. She checked her cell count. I said not bad. I did not say good. Then she handed me a Elho stick, and I took it, and my hands were steady, because the fear mechanism was still broken, and I smoked it, and it was the best low stick I have ever had in my life. Not because of the tobacco, but because for the 90 seconds it took me to smoke it, I was doing something normal. The second week is when the real education started. See, the first attack, the one I just described, that was a probing assault. That was the hive mind poking us to see what we did. It was not trying to take the wall. It was gathering information. What we took from it was that we had held, that we had lost 43 but held, and that holding was something you could build on. The second night, the attack came from below. Not over the wall, under it, through the drainage infrastructure that ran beneath the hive's foundation layer, tunnels that were supposed to be too narrow for anything bigger than a maintenance servitor. And they were too narrow for a Hormagaunt or a Termagant or anything we had been trained to fight. But they were not too narrow for Rippers, and Rippers do not need to be big. They need to be many. They came up through the floor drains in the hab blocks behind the wall, thousands of them, in the middle of a shift rotation when half the wall garrison was sleeping and the other half was walking back to their posts. And the first sign was a trooper screaming in a washroom 200 meters behind the perimeter, and by the time anyone got to him, there was nothing left of him below the knees. I was on the wall when it happened. I heard the screaming behind me, turned around, and saw rippers pouring out of a drainage grate in the street, like water flowing uphill. Each one was about the length of my forearm, with jaws that could shear through boot leather and flak armor and flesh in about 2 bites. And they moved in a carpet, a living carpet, hundreds of them boiling out of every drain and vent and crack in the street surface, and the soldiers in the street were firing downward, shooting at their own feet, and the rippers were climbing up their legs faster than they could aim. That night cost us 91, more than double the first attack, and we had not even been hit from the front. The wall was intact. Every defensive position was untouched. 91 men killed from below, through infrastructure that was supposed to be sealed, and when the engineers went down to check the drainage tunnels, they found that the tunnels had been widened. Not by tools, by acid. The Tyranids had secreted something that dissolved the tunnel walls and expanded the passage, and they had been doing it for days before the attack, quietly, patiently, while we were watching the horizon. The first night they tested our walls. The second night they went around them. The third night they came from above. Gargoyles. Flying organisms, hundreds of them, dropping out of the spore clouds directly into the city interior, bypassing the wall entirely, landing on rooftops and in courtyards, and on the heads of men who were looking at the floor drains because they were expecting rippers. 8 men died in the first 30 seconds because they were facing down when the threat came from up. The fourth night, they hit us from all 3 directions simultaneously, wall and drains and air at once, at 3 different points along our section, timed to the minute of our watch rotation, so the relief was in the corridors, and the outgoing watch was packing kit, and neither group was in position. By the 5th night, our defensive plan was meaningless, because every assumption it was built on had been specifically and deliberately invalidated by an intelligence that was rewriting its approach faster than we could rewrite ours. I stopped sleeping around this time. Not because I chose to, because every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound a ripper swarm makes when it is moving through a confined space. A wet clicking sound, like someone shuffling a deck of cards made of bone, and I would hear it and my eyes would open, and I would lie on my cot and stare at the ceiling and listen to the drains. Other men had the same problem. By the end of the 2nd week, the regiment's combat effectiveness was down by 1/3, and half of that loss was not casualties, it was exhaustion. Men falling asleep on watch, men walking into walls, men having conversations with people who were not there. Our regimental commissar, a man named Gelvani, who had been adequate in the way that commissars are adequate, meaning he stood behind the line and made threats that kept people in front of it, shot 2 men for sleeping at their post on the 9th day. On the 10th day, he shot a 3rd. And Corvan said quietly to me and nobody else that if he shot a 4th, she was going to have a problem with it, because we were losing more men to his bolt pistol than to the gargoyles. In a regiment that was functioning, in a garrison with a working command structure and a chaplain, and men with the energy to talk to each other. That sentence reaches Gelvane inside a day, and Corvan is shot against a wall for it, and the man who heard her say it is shot beside her for not reporting it. That is the procedure. I have seen it followed on a training world over something smaller. Corvan died with an arm missing on level 5, instead of with a bolt round in her chest on the fire step, because by the 10th day, nobody had the energy to inform on anybody. What saved my sergeant was the collapse of everything keeping us alive. On the 11th day, he stopped shooting people because there was nobody left to shoot who was still awake. And on the 14th day, he died in the corridor, Ripper assault with his pistol in his hand and his back to a wall. And I will say this for Gelvain. He died facing forward, which is more than his job required. Men prayed after that. Not to the Commissar, to the Emperor. The old words, the rote ones, the ones you learn before you learn to read. Throne, protect us. Emperor, guide our hands. Deliver us from the alien and the heretic. I said them too. Everyone did. Not because we believed they would work, but because saying them was something to do with your mouth that was not screaming. And because the sound of human voices reciting human words in a human language was the only thing in that entire city that did not belong to the Tyranids. Drossenmarch had been a hive of 6 cathedrals and a ministorum establishment large enough to have its own internal politics, and by the time we arrived it had 4 confessors left on the wall circuit, and one of them was 90 years old. They walked the fire steps at dusk with a censer and a vox amp, and read the litany of fortitude, and the amp was louder than the censer was fragrant, and after the first week the smoke did not reach anyone because the air was already carrying something else. The 90-year-old was called Lamech. He did the whole of Sector 14 on foot, every evening, and he never once asked a man whether he had confessed, which I understood later was because there were more men than evenings, and he had done the arithmetic. He gave the same benediction to everyone and moved on. I watched him work a firing position where 3 men had died that morning, and he did not slow at their places or speed up either. That is the closest thing to comfort the ministorum had left to distribute, and he distributed it at a walking pace until he stopped appearing, which was around the time the walls came down and nobody announced it. The medici said the sleeplessness was stress and fatigue, but I do not think it was only that. I think the shadow in the warp was doing something to us. I think it was pressing against our minds the way the spores were pressing against our lungs, constantly, invisibly, and we were breathing it in, and it was making us into something that was not quite what we had been before. The nightmares were the proof. Not that we were having nightmares. Everyone has nightmares in a combat zone. The proof was that we were all having the same one. I found that out on the 9th day when I was talking to Trooper Vesht, a big, quiet man from 3rd Squad who had worked the same Immerbeck docks I had, 4 berths down, for 6 years without either of us learning the other's name. The Munitorum draws its lottery by district and ships the district together, which is why half my squad had come off the same wharves. He said, "Did you dream about the dark room?" And I stopped moving, because I had. A dark room with no walls and no floor, and something in it that was aware of me, not looking at me because it did not have eyes, just aware. The way you are aware of a crumb on your shirt, the way you are aware of something that is too small to bother with, but you know it is there, and eventually you will brush it off. That was the dream. Being noticed briefly by something so large that the noticing itself felt like a physical weight, and then having the weight lift and go elsewhere, and waking up certain that whatever had lifted it had not gone away and had not decided anything about you yet. Every man I asked had the same one. Every single one. We were dreaming the hive mind, or the hive mind was dreaming us, and I do not know which of those is worse. The ammunition problem started before anybody called it one. It sounds like a logistics complaint. It killed more of us than the Tyranids did directly. Standard guard issue for a rifleman is 4 power cells per day in a sustained combat environment. 4 cells, 60 shots per cell, 240 shots. Against orcs, that is plenty. Against heretics, that is more than enough. Against Tyranids, that is nothing. I could write a very short book about the things that are enough against Tyranids. It would be blank. I burned 4 cells in the first hour of an engagement and spent the remaining 9 borrowing from dead men and hoping they came at some other section of wall before I ran dry. A Hormagaunt takes between 3 and 6 last rounds to put down, depending on where you hit it and how fresh it is. And fresh is the important word there, because a Hormagaunt that has been spawned from a reclamation pool that morning is tougher than one that has been running for 3 days, since the hive mind puts more biomass into the newer ones. It has learned what works and what does not. It is always learning. That is the single most important thing I can tell you about fighting these things. 4 cells a day. That was the allocation. The supply depot behind Sector 14 had enough cells for 6 days at that rate. 6 days. After that, we were dependent on resupply from the Hive's central armory, which was dependent on the manufacturing lines, which were dependent on raw materials, which were dependent on supply routes that ran through the Underhive. My hands still do a thing when I say that word. They clench and unclench without my permission. The Mediki calls it a stress response. I call it my body remembering something my brain has been trying to forget. But the ammunition. The Tyranids did not just attack us, they attacked our ammunition. On the 12th day, a wave of organisms I had not seen before, small, fast, 6-legged things about the size of a dog, came through a section of wall that had been breached 2 days earlier and patched with rubble and wire. They did not attack the soldiers. They ran past them, through the defensive positions and into the rear areas, straight for the power cell crates, and they did not eat them exactly. They excreted something on them, a thick fluid that reacted with the cell casing and cracked it. And a cracked power cell is not just useless. It is dangerous, because the energy release from a ruptured cell is enough to take your hand off if you are holding it, and enough to cook off an entire crate if you are standing next to one. We lost 17 men to the secondary explosions, 17 men and 4 days' worth of power cells, and the organisms that did it, every single one of them, died within minutes of completing their task because they were not built to survive. They were built to do one thing and then stop being alive, and the hive mind considered that a perfectly acceptable exchange rate. That was when I started to understand the economics of it. I am not a clever man. I was a dockloader on Immerbeck before the Munitorum put a number on me, and a last gun in my hands and sent me to places I had never heard of to die for reasons I was not authorized to know. The only clever thing I ever did at the depot was mislabel a pallet of nutrient blocks as industrial solvent, and that was not clever. That was an accident. And the only reason I did not get discharged for it was because the administratum clerk who processed the correction thought it was funny instead of criminal, and she had a laugh that stayed in my head for weeks afterwards. But I understand logistics. I understand supply chains. I understand that if you have 10 crates and you are using 1 a day and nobody is sending more, then you have 10 days, and after 10 days you have nothing. The Tyranids understood it better than we did because they were timing it. The attacks always came within a day of a delivery landing when the depots were fullest, because a full depot gives the biggest secondary explosion and the longest gap before the next one. An intelligence the size of a solar system was reading our ammunition schedule. The world was changing, and I do not think anyone who has not stood on a consumed planet can picture it from words alone. When we arrived, Grenthar had an atmosphere. Thin, industrial, the kind of air you get on a hive world that has been manufacturing for 3,000 years and has not seen natural vegetation in a millennium, but air. Breathable. By the 3rd week, the air had a texture. You could feel it on your skin. A fine grit that accumulated in the creases of your uniform and in the corners of your eyes and in the mechanism of your lasgun. And it was not dust, it was organic matter, broken down to particles so small you could not see them individually, but en masse they formed a haze that cut visibility to about 400 meters outside the wall and about 600 inside the city, and the haze had a color, a greenish-yellow tint that got thicker every day, and the medics issued rebreathers on the 16th day, and by the 18th day the rebreathers were clogging, and we were pulling them off to clear the filters and breathing the raw air for 30 seconds at a time, and coughing up something that looked like gray paste. The rebreathers were designed by someone who had never stood on a consumed world, which is to say by someone who was still alive, which is to say they did not work. The water went next. Hive Drossenmarch ran on a closed-loop recycling system, the same as any hive, and the recyclers started failing in the 3rd week. Not mechanical failure, biological contamination. Something was growing in the pipes that had not been there before, and was not in any maintenance manual, and it reproduced faster than anything could clear it, which meant it stopped being our problem and became theirs. A hive's water plant, its atmospheric processors, and its generatorum are not run by the Planetary Defense Force or by anybody a colonel can give an order to. They are run by the Adeptus Mechanicus, out of an enclave older than the governing charter, on the arrangement that holds everywhere. They keep the world breathing and drinking, and nobody asks them anything. There were 3 of their engineers attached to our sector for the tanks. They did not speak to us. They came when a machine needed them, and they conducted the rites, and they left, and one of them worked on our 2nd Lehman Russ for 2 hours in complete silence while the wall was being shelled, and did not once look at the wall. What I think happened to the enclave is a guess. The recyclers failed from below, in the deep plant levels, which sit in the enclave and not in the hive. Whatever went wrong down there went wrong inside a boundary Treskova could not send a man across, and had no lawful way to ask about. The Mechanicus knew what was in the underhive before any of us did. They must have. It was eating their machinery. What they did with that was keep the enclave sealed and go on conducting the rites in our sector for another 9 days. There is no form on which an adept informs a colonel that her city is being digested. The last of the 3 left on the 22nd day with his servitors and did not say goodbye. And it did not occur to me then why the tanks stopped being maintained. The water out of the taps went from yellowish to brownish, to a color I would describe as the color of something that has been dead for a week, and it smelled like it too, and we boiled everything and drank it anyway because the alternative was not drinking. The noise changed, and I have never heard another man from that wall mention it. In the 1st week there was sound. The hive had sound, machinery, generators, ventilation systems, the constant background hum of a city that is running. By the 3rd week, the background hum was gone. Not reduced, gone. As if someone had turned off everything below a certain frequency and left only the high sounds, and in the spaces where the hum used to be, there was something else. Not the ground shake of something heavy walking, which I had felt from the wall on my 2nd day and could at least attribute to a body with weight in it. This had no source and no rhythm. A vibration that was not quite sound, more like pressure, more like the feeling you get in your chest when you stand too close to a very large engine, except there was no engine and the pressure was coming from everywhere, from the walls and the floor and the air itself. And it never stopped, and you could not get away from it, and after a while you stopped noticing it consciously, and it went to work on whatever part of you operates below the level of noticing. I asked one of the Planetary Defense Force veterans about it, an old corporal named Orvin, who had been on the wall since day 1 and had the eyes of a man who had seen everything he was ever going to see and had stopped being surprised by any of it. I asked him what the vibration was, and he looked at me and he said, That is the planet digesting. And I laughed, because I thought he was joking, and he did not laugh back. And then I stopped laughing. Then came the towers. On the 19th day, a runner came up from the command post with orders to hold position and maintain observation, which was what we had been doing anyway. But the runner was shaking, and not the kind of shaking you get from exhaustion, the kind you get from having seen something that your brain has not finished processing. Corvan asked him what was wrong. "They have started building," he said. "Building what?" He pointed. "Look southeast." So I looked southeast, through the haze, through the spore-thickened air, and at first I did not understand what I was seeing, because it was too big to be a structure and too regular to be a natural formation. And then my brain caught up, and I understood, and I sat down on the firing step, because my legs stopped working. A tower, a biological tower, rising out of the ground about 8 kilometers southeast of the hive wall, and it was enormous. It was bigger than anything I had ever seen built by any species, a tapering column of organic matter that was already taller than the hive wall and still growing, visibly growing. I could see it getting taller as I watched, like a plant in a time-lapse vid, and it was connected to the ground by a mass of root-like structures that spread across the landscape like veins on the back of a hand, and the roots were pulsing rhythmically, a slow contraction-expansion cycle that moved fluid from the ground into the tower, and from the tower up toward the upper atmosphere, where the spore clouds were thickest, and the sky was no longer a sky, but a ceiling of living matter. That was how they feed, the capillary towers. Nobody on that wall knew the name. We called them the spires for 3 days and then stopped calling them anything. I got the word and the mechanism out of a Munitorum debriefing weeks later. They grow them on the surface of a world they are consuming, and they use them to pump digested biomass into orbit, into the waiting hive ships, and the roots of the towers are what does the actual digestion, breaking down everything in the soil, everything organic, everything that was ever alive, and converting it into a fluid that gets drawn upward by the tower's own peristaltic action. The planet was being drunk. That is the only word that fits. It was being drunk through a straw, and the straw was 8 kilometers away and growing taller by the hour. I saw 4 of them by the end of the 4th week. 4 capillary towers, visible from the wall, spaced around the hive at irregular intervals, and each one taller than the last, and the ground between them was changing color, going from brown to gray because the brown had been living matter, and the gray was what was left after the roots had finished with it. Bare mineral substrate. Rock. The towers were stripping the planet down to the bedrock and pumping everything else into space. And the hive wall, our wall, the thing we were defending, was sitting on top of the only patch of unconsumed ground within visible range. And we were holding it not because we were strong, but because the hive mind had not gotten around to us yet. Corvan saw me looking at the towers on the 21st day. "Stop looking at those," she said. "They are getting bigger," I told her. She did not turn her head. "I know they are getting bigger. Stop looking at them." Then, "You cannot shoot a building, Mossik. It is not a building," I said. "It is a digestive organ." And she said you could not shoot a digestive organ either, so stop looking at it and check your cell count. She was right. She was always right about the practical things, which was her whole gift. Reduce any horror to a task list, then work the list. We were running out of power cells. We were running out of clean water. The rebreathers were clogging faster than we could clear them. The food was running low because the supply convoys from the central armory had started taking casualties to organisms that were now inside the hive, in the mid-levels, in the transit corridors, and every convoy required a platoon-strength escort, and sometimes the escort took losses, and sometimes the convoy did not arrive at all, and we ate half rations and then quarter rations, and then whatever we could find in the abandoned habitation blocks behind the wall. The Munitorum supply requisition has a box for delivered and a box for not delivered. It does not have a box for consumed en route by alien organisms. I checked. I ate something on the 23rd day that I think used to be a pet. I do not want to talk about it. The attacks kept coming. Every night, sometimes twice a night, sometimes during the day when the chrono said it should be safe, because the Tyranids did not operate on a schedule that had anything to do with light or dark. They operated on a schedule that had to do with us, with when we were weakest, with when our watch rotations were thinnest, with when our ammunition was lowest. And they knew these things because they were watching, always watching, through senses I cannot describe, because human language does not have words for the way a Tyranid perceives the world. They hit Sector 14 hard on the 25th night. A major assault, the biggest since we had arrived, and it was different from the first attacks in ways that made my stomach drop before the first shot was fired. The Hormagaunts came in low, belly down against the ground, using the bodies of dead organisms from previous attacks as cover. And I want you to think about that for a second. They were using their own dead as terrain. The ground outside the wall was carpeted with Tyranid corpses from 3 weeks of fighting, and the new wave was navigating through them like soldiers moving through a trench system, and the corpses were providing cover because the bodies of Tyranid organisms do not decay the way anything else does. They harden. The chitin plates lock. The internal fluids solidify into a substance like dense rubber. And the result is that a dead Hormagaunt becomes a piece of cover that can absorb a loss round. And there were thousands of them out there, a ready-made defensive fortification built from the bodies of the Hive Mind's own casualties. It had spent 3 weeks paying for that cover in corpses, and it had never once tried to recover them. They learn. Alongside the Hormagaunts, something new, something I had not seen before and that was not in any primer I had read. A mid-sized organism, larger than a termagant but built differently, lower to the ground, with a dorsal crest that pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, and it was not attacking. It was standing behind the assault wave, motionless, and every organism within about 200 meters of it was moving with a coordination that the organisms outside that radius did not have. The ones near the crested thing attacked in sequence, covering each other, flanking, actually flanking, as if they were soldiers executing a battle plan rather than animals swarming a wall. The ones outside the radius were still behaving like organisms, fast and deadly but disorganized, and the difference was so stark that even in the middle of a firefight, I noticed it. A warrior. A Tyranid warrior. A synapse creature. The link between the hive mind and the swarm, the thing that carries the signal that turns 1,000,000 individual organisms into a single coordinated army. The primer says to prioritize synapse creatures because killing them degrades the swarm around them to instinct. The primer is correct. The primer does not mention that a Tyranid warrior is 4 meters tall, armored in chitin plate that shrugs off gun fire like rain, carrying a weapon that can shred a man at 200 meters, and surrounded at all times by organisms that will throw themselves between it and any incoming fire. Because the hive mind values the warrior more than it values 100 Hormagaunts, and 100 Hormagaunts is 100 bodies between your gun and the thing you need to kill. We lost Corvan that night. Not killed. Worse than killed. A warrior bio-weapon, something that fired a cluster of barbed projectiles that punched through her flak armor and hooked into her shoulder and upper arm, and then started doing something to the tissue around the wound, swelling it, changing its color. And she was screaming, "Corvan! who never raised her voice, was screaming, and the medic got to her and cut the barbs out, and the flesh around each barb was black, and the black was spreading, and the medic did something with a cauterizing blade that I could smell from 3 meters away, and Corvan stopped screaming and started making a sound that was quieter and worse. She lost the arm. They took it off at the shoulder in a field surgery station that used to be someone's kitchen, and I held the lantern because the power had gone out in that block, and there was nobody else, and the surgeon needed light, and I stood there holding a lamp while my sergeant's arm was removed on a dining table, and I thought, this is what fighting Tyranids means. Not the wall, not the shooting. This. She was back on the wall in 3 days. 1 arm, a bandage that was already turning gray from the spores in the air, and her last gun propped on the parapet because she could not hold it one-handed and aim at the same time. And she was firing with her remaining hand steadied against the rock crete. "You should be in the medici ward," I said. She told me there was no medici ward anymore. There were 2 medics and a corridor, and they were full, and she kept firing. I noticed things before the patrols did, because my brain will not stop comparing what is in front of me to what was there yesterday. I noticed that the floor in our billet had changed temperature. The walls in the lower corridors were damp in places that had been dry 3 days earlier. The maintenance servitors had stopped their rounds, and nobody had commented on it because nobody watches maintenance servitors the way nobody watches pipes. I did not report any of it. I have given myself reasons since that I did not know what it meant. That a corporal who reports a warm floor gets a note on his file that follows him for the rest of his service. Both true, neither of them why. Reporting it meant standing in front of an officer and saying out loud that something was wrong underneath us, and once you say that, you have to keep thinking about it. So I filed it where I file things and went back to the wall. I had known something was wrong under Drossenmarch since about day 22, and the patrol did not go down until the 28th. 6 days would have changed nothing. The underhive had been gone for weeks before I ever felt a warm floor. That is almost certainly correct, and it has never once helped. Day 28. A patrol from 8th Company, working the mid-levels of Drossenmarch, reported that they had lost contact with the underhive maintenance teams. This was not immediately alarming because communications had been unreliable for weeks. The Vox network was degrading. Something in the spore saturation was interfering with frequencies, and maintenance teams in the underhive were always hard to reach, because the hive's lower levels were shielded by the same industrial infrastructure that made them useful. So the patrol went down to check, because that is what you do. You send people to check, and you expect them to come back with a report about broken Vox relays and backed-up sewage lines and maybe a few rippers in the drainage system that need clearing out. The patrol did not come back. A second patrol was sent. Platoon strength, 30 men, with a Vox officer and orders to report every 15 minutes. They went down the main access shaft into Hive Drossenmarch, Level 1, the uppermost of the 12 sub-levels that made up the Hive's infrastructure foundation. I was not on the command net, and I never have been. What a corporal gets is the version that comes back up the stairs, and this one came up in about 4 hours by way of a runner, talking to a sergeant who talked to Corvan, and I am giving it to you the way I got it, which is second-hand and possibly wrong in the details. What the runner said was that the patrol reported in at the first checkpoint and the second checkpoint, and at the third checkpoint, they said something the Vox officer on the surface asked them to repeat, because the first time he heard it, he thought the transmission was garbled. They said the walls were moving. The next report said Level 1 was compromised. Tyranid organisms everywhere, not just rippers, not just feeder forms, but established biological structures growing out of the walls and floors and ceiling. organic conduits and membranes and node clusters that looked like they had been there for weeks, not days. Weeks, growing in the dark while the hive went about its business above, and the maintenance teams that had been working down there were gone. Not dead. Gone. No bodies, no equipment, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all except for a single maintenance hatch that had been wedged open from the inside and had something growing through it that the patrol leader described as looking like a root but made of flesh. Level 2 was worse. Level 3 was impassable. The patrol turned back at Level 3 because the air was no longer breathable without a sealed rebreather, and their rebreathers were clogging within minutes, and the biological growth on the walls was so thick that the corridor was narrowing, and something ahead of them in the dark was making the clicking sound, the card shuffling sound. And they came back up at a run, and the patrol leader went straight to the command post, and I know what he reported because I was on the wall directly above the access shaft, and I saw his face when he came out. And that face told me everything before any official report was issued. Drossenmarch was hollow. The hive, the last hive on Grenthar, the thing we had been defending for a month, was being consumed from below. The entire underhive, 12 levels of infrastructure, water recycling, power generation, atmospheric processing, waste management, all of it was already Tyranid territory. Had been for weeks, possibly since before we arrived. The organisms had come in through the deep foundations, through geological fissures and ancient mining shafts and drainage systems that ran beneath the hive's structural bedrock, and they had worked their way upward, level by level, consuming everything organic, converting the infrastructure into biological growth medium, and they had done it silently, patiently, without triggering a single alarm, because the systems they were consuming were the same systems that would have detected them. The water, the yellowish water we had been drinking for weeks. That was not contamination. That was digestion. The recyclers were not failing because of foreign organisms in the pipes. The pipes were being digested. We had been drinking the byproduct of our own hive being eaten alive, filtered through recyclers that were themselves being broken down, and the gray paste I had been coughing up was not spore residue. It was the hive. It was Drossenmarch, processed and aerosolized and drawn into our lungs with every breath. The civilians. 600 million people had lived on Grenthar, and not all of them had lived in Drossenmarch. Kanvelden emptied northward for a fortnight before it fell, and Drossenmarch took what arrived, because a hive governor who turns away his own planet's population has a different sort of problem by the following week. Nobody had anywhere to put them. You cannot billet several million people in a hive that is already full. So they went where the space was, which on a hive world is always down. They were still arriving in the second week we were on the wall. I watched columns of them come through the eastern gate under escort, and I remember thinking that at least those ones had got out, and that is the single most wrong thing I have ever thought in my life. The majority of Drossenmarch's own population, hundreds of millions, had gone the same way when the surface fighting started, because that is what you do on a hive world when the walls are under attack. You go down, you go into the deep levels where the infrastructure is thickest and the walls are strongest, and they had done that, millions of them, and the things in the underhive had been waiting for them. There were no bodies. Tyranids do not leave bodies. Hundreds of millions of people, and the only evidence they had ever existed was the brownish tint in the water that came out of our taps. I thought about the children's toy I had picked up on the landing zone, the stamped tin Aquila I had held for 3 seconds and put back in the rubble. The child who owned it had gone down. into the underhive, into the infrastructure levels where the walls were moving and the air was not breathable and there were no bodies. I wished I had kept the thing. I do not know why. It would not have changed anything, but I wished I had kept it. I threw up when I understood. I am not ashamed of that. I threw up, and then I drank water from my canteen, and then I threw up again because I remembered where the water came from, and then I put my helmet back on and went back to the wall because there was nowhere else to go, and the wall did not mean anything anymore, but it was a place to stand, and I needed a place to stand. Man went down. That was the phrase. Once Gelvain was dead, there was nobody whose function was to shoot you for leaving, and a hive is the easiest place in the galaxy to stop being a soldier in, because it has 10,000 levels and most of them are dark. In the third week, we lost men off the wall who were not casualties. Nobody chased them. Nobody could spare the people to chase them. And I think, if I am honest, that a fair number of us understood the arithmetic and had not got round to acting on it. It stopped on day 28, and not one man went down after it, and I do not think a single order was issued about it. When the patrol came back up the main access shaft and the word got round about what level 1 looked like, every soldier in Drossenmarch understood at the same moment that there was no down. There had never been a down. The men who had gone into the mid-levels in the third week had not deserted to anywhere. They had walked into it early, on their own feet, thinking they were saving themselves, and I do not know whether any of them had time to work out where they were. Colonel Treskova issued new orders that afternoon. Pull back from the outer perimeter, consolidate forces in the inner hive, seal the mid-level access points, prepare for defensive operations on a reduced perimeter. The orders were delivered by a runner who looked like he was about 15 years old and had been crying. His rank insignia was upside down. I did not correct him because mine was missing, and nobody commented on the crying because every single one of us wanted to be doing the same thing, and about half of us were. The inner hive was not much of an improvement. Smaller perimeter, yes. Easier to defend, in theory. But the consolidation meant abandoning Sector 14, abandoning the wall I had been standing on for 4 weeks, abandoning the firing positions and the heavy weapon emplacements and the 2 Lehman Russ tanks that could not be moved because one had thrown a track and the other had taken a bioacid hit to its engine block, and both of them were now permanent installations in a defensive line that no longer existed. The crews stayed with the tanks. What came back down the line to us, third or fourth hand, was that Tank Bravo, the one with the damaged engine, had asked for additional power cells and been told there were none. Nobody heard anything from them after that. Old Orven, the Planetary Defense Force corporal who had told me the planet was digesting, did not make the pullback. I saw his section peel off the wall in good order, covering by pairs the way soldiers cover, and then a section of the wall foundation gave way beneath them, just crumbled inward like it was hollow, which it was, and the rippers in the cavity took 4 of his men before anyone could fire a shot. Orven pulled 2 of them out. The other 2 he could not reach because there was no floor left to stand on. He was still on the wall when we lost visual contact with Sector 14, and I never saw him again, and I do not know if he made it to the inner hive or not, but I suspect not, because the man who told me the planet was digesting was standing on the part of it that was being digested when I last saw him. We pulled back through hab blocks that were empty. Not evacuated. Empty. The difference is that evacuated means people left. Empty means people were never given the chance. Doors open, lights on in the ones that still had power, meals on tables, a glow stick still smoldering in an ashtray in one room, which means whoever lived there had been taken in the time it takes a glow stick to burn down, and a glow stick takes about 6 minutes. and 6 minutes was enough. We were food that had not been eaten yet. That was all this was. The inner hive held for 11 days. 11 days of attacks that came from every direction now, not just the wall, not just below, but from inside the hive structure itself, from air ducts and elevator shafts and the spaces between walls where Tyranid organisms had been growing for weeks. Organisms that had been small when they entered and had grown larger in the dark, fed by the biological material that surrounded them, and they burst out of the infrastructure like something hatching, fully formed, armed, directed, and they hit us in places we thought were secure, because nothing is secure when the building you are standing in is the enemy. I killed a lot of things in those 11 days. I do not know how many. I stopped keeping track around day 30 because the numbers stopped meaning anything. You kill 50 Hormagaunts and 50 more appear. You kill those and 100 replace them. You burn through your ammunition and scrounge more from the dead, and burn through that, and the dead are your friends now. The dead are Senek and Trooper Hanfeld and Corporal Gessin from 2nd Platoon, who used to do card tricks with a Munitorum requisition deck. And you are pulling power cells from their webbing and trying not to look at their faces and trying not to think about how by tomorrow their bodies will be part of the brown carpet and their biomass will be feeding the thing that killed them. We burned our dead for the first 16 days. That is doctrine, and it is also common sense, because a body left out is a delivery. And there were men on that wall who had worked out on their own that the thing coming at them tomorrow would be partly made of the man beside them today. So there was a detail. 4 men, a fuel Bowser, a stretch of rock crete behind the 3rd bastion, and it ran every evening. It stopped on the 17th day, and I know exactly why, because the order came down through Corvan and she read it out flat. A Bowser of fuel burns roughly 30 men. The same Bowser runs a Lehman Russ for 2 days, or the sector's generators for 1, and the generators run the wall lights and the Vox and the pumps. Somebody at command sat down with those figures and worked out what a corpse was worth against what a working tank was worth, and the answer was not close. And after the 17th day, we carried our dead to a collection point on the eastern slope, put them down, and left them there. I do not blame whoever signed it. The arithmetic comes out the same when I do it. But it means that for the last 4 weeks of my life on Grenthar, I was fighting organisms that had been in part my own regiment, and the hive mind got the whole of the 163rd Immerbeck in the end in installments. And about half of it went into the enemy, while the men who had known them were still alive to watch it happen. There was a moment around day 34 when I was fighting in a corridor on the 3rd level of the inner hive, and I killed a Hormagaunt at close range, close enough that its blood, its fluid, whatever the stuff is, hit me in the face, and it was warm, and it smelled like meat, not rotten. Not alien, just meat, like the protein slurry they served in the mess on Immerbeck, and for one horrible second my brain, my stupid, exhausted, half-broken brain, registered the smell as food, and I almost gagged, not because of the smell, but because of my reaction to the smell. Because some part of me that was still functioning on a basic animal level had responded to the scent of processed biological matter, the way a hungry person responds to the smell of a meal. After weeks of breathing their spores and drinking their water, the boundary gets thin, not physically, perceptually. Your body adapts to a new environment the way bodies adapt to anything, and the horror starts feeling normal, and you do not notice it happening until it has happened. Corvan died on day 36. I am going to say that and move on because if I stop to talk about it, I am going to lose the thread of this. And I need to keep the thread because the thread is the only thing holding this together. She died holding a corridor on level 5 against a brood of warriors that came through the floor. 3 of them, 4 meters tall, chitin-like tank armor, and they came up through the floor tiles like the floor was water and they were surfacing, and Corvan was the first one to react, because Corvan was always the first one to react. And she put 2 shots into the lead warrior's head with her one remaining arm braced against a door frame, and both shots bounced off its crest plate, and it looked at her. And I swear on the Emperor's bones, it looked at her specifically. The way you look at something that has irritated you. The way you look at an insect that has bitten you before you swat it, and then it moved and she was gone. And I did not see what happened because I was already running and firing, and someone was screaming, and it might have been me. I found out afterwards that something had opened my back from the shoulder blade to the bottom of the ribs on the left side. I do not know which of the 3 did it, and I did not feel it happen. I found out because a man behind me in the corridor told me I was wet, and I put my hand round and it came back the way you would expect, and then I sat down on the floor, because knowing about a thing like that is what makes your legs stop. It was shallow the whole way along, which the medic said was luck, and which I think was whatever swung at me aiming at something else, and I was in the arc. He put a field dressing on it and a row of staples in the deep part, and told me to keep the arm still, which is not a thing you can do, and it opened twice more before Grenthar was finished. It is the only wound I took in 44 days. Men who ask about the scar get told an orc did it on a different world. We killed all 3 warriors. It took 9 of us and every grenade we had, and Trooper Vesht, who had not spoken more than 3 sentences in a row since the nightmare started, hit the last one with a mining charge he had found in an equipment locker, and the blast collapsed a section of ceiling onto the warrior and pinned it. And Vesht walked up to it and put his last gun against the gap in its neck armor, and fired until his cell was empty and the warrior stopped moving. Vesht looked at me afterwards and he said, "That was for the dark room," and I understood, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. The warrior was dead, and Corvan was dead, and the corridor was held, and none of it mattered because the floor was still compromised, and more would come through, and we both knew it. By day 38, the regiment was combat ineffective. Our own colonel had been dead since the 14th day, killed in the same corridor assault that took Gelvene, and nobody had been formally appointed to replace him, which meant that for a month, the 163rd was commanded by whichever captain was still breathing and could find a working Vox. And after the 20th day, it was not commanded at all, so much as it continued. I do not know the exact numbers because the command structure had broken down to the point where nobody was tracking numbers anymore. But my estimate, and it is just an estimate based on how many faces I recognized in the assembly area, is that the 163rd Immerbeck had gone from roughly 2,000 combat-effective soldiers to somewhere between 200 and 300, and the Grenthar Planetary Defense Force, which had started with about 15,000 men and women under arms, was down to maybe 1,000, maybe less. And the combined garrison of Hive Drossenmarch was less than the population of the Hab block I had grown up in on Immerbeck. Colonel Treskova was still alive. I saw her on day 39 in the command bunker, and she looked like a person who had been dead for a week and had not been told. Gray skin, sunken eyes, moving on autopilot, issuing orders that were technically correct and practically meaningless because the perimeter she was ordering us to hold did not exist in any defensible sense anymore. The hive was compromised. The walls, the infrastructure, the ground itself. Tyranid organisms were everywhere, in the walls, under the floors, in the ceilings, and the only reason we were still alive was that the main assault force, the big organisms, the Carnifexes and the Bio-Titans, and the things I do not have names for that moved in the haze beyond the hive wall had not come in yet. I spent weeks on that wall thinking those things were being held back. A reserve. The officer at my debriefing corrected it in 9 words. A Carnifex is not a siege weapon, it is a digging weapon. What they were doing in the haze for 40 days was breaking bedrock and clearing ground for the tower roots. And there is no reason to bring the excavation equipment to the wall when the wall is not the job. The wall got gaunts, and whatever the swarm had spare. I thought I was fighting the invasion of Grenthar. I was fighting the part of it with nothing better to do. They were waiting. Everything was waiting, and I was starting to understand why. Then the attacks stopped. Day 40, 0300 local time. The wall sensors had been going off every few hours for a week. Each alarm, another breach, another incursion, another desperate firefight in a corridor or a stairwell or a room that used to be someone's home. And at 0300 on day 40, they stopped. Not a lull. Not a gap between waves. The sensors went quiet and stayed quiet. The organisms in the walls stopped moving. The clicking in the drains stopped. The pressure in my chest, the vibration that had been constant for weeks, the one that Orvin had called the planet digesting, changed. Not louder, not softer, different. A shift in frequency, like a machine changing gear, and then a sensation I do not know how to describe, except to say that it felt like being put down. Like whatever had been holding me, whatever awareness had been pressing against my mind since the astropath screamed on the transport, had shifted its attention elsewhere, and I was no longer in its grip. And the relief was so sudden and so total that I almost fell over. Silence. No chittering, no clicking, no flesh-bore fire, no screaming. Just the hive dying quietly around us, the groan of structures losing integrity, the drip of contaminated water, and the breathing of the people still alive. We waited. An hour, 2 hours, half a day. Nobody slept because nobody trusted the silence, and nobody attacked because there was nothing to attack. And we sat in our positions with our weapons pointed at nothing and waited for something to happen, and nothing happened. On the second day of silence, a scout team went to the wall. They came back with a report that the assault organisms had withdrawn to a distance of about 2 kilometers and were stationary. Not dead, not gone. Standing in formation, motionless like an army at parade rest. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, an ocean of chitin and claw and bioweapon, and they were not moving. The rippers on the ground had stopped circulating. The termagants had lowered their weapon arms. The warriors were still, their crested heads tilted at an angle that, if they had been human, I would have described as listening. On the third day, Trooper Vesht figured it out. He figured it out because he went to the water tap and nothing came out. The taps were dry. The recyclers had stopped. Not broken, not contaminated, stopped, because the pipes that fed them had been consumed. The atmospheric processors in the hive's upper levels had shut down because the intake vents were sealed with biological growth, and the backup systems had failed days ago, and nobody had noticed because we had been breathing spore-saturated air for so long that we had stopped noticing the difference. The food stores in the central depot had been accessed from below, through the floor, and everything in them had been replaced by a thin layer of organic residue that might have been food once and was now just another form of Tyranid substrate. We had no water, we had no food, we had no clean air. We had ammunition for maybe 2 more days of fighting, and nothing was attacking us, and that was when I understood what the silence meant. The Tyranids were not waiting to attack. They were waiting for us to die. The battle was over. The planet was consumed. The biomass had been harvested. The atmosphere was being siphoned. The capillary towers were pumping everything upward into the Hive fleet's waiting ships, and the small pocket of armed humans huddled in the wreckage of the last Hive city was not worth the energy expenditure of killing. We were a rounding error. The Hive mind had turned us off, cut us out of its calculations, and left us to starve on a world that was no longer a world in any sense that mattered. I sat on the floor of a corridor in level 3 of the inner Hive, and I held my empty canteen, and I listened to the silence, and I waited to die. And the silence waited with me, and it was patient, and I was not. The silence lasted 5 days. 5 days of nothing. 5 days of sitting in a dying hive on a dead planet with no water and no food and air that was getting thinner by the hour. Those 5 days were worse than the fighting. When you are fighting, you have adrenaline. You have purpose. You have the basic animal machinery of survival pumping chemicals into your blood that keep you moving and reacting and not thinking about anything except the next 2 seconds. When the fighting stops, all of that drains out of you like water from a cracked tank. And what is left is just you, the actual you, the small wet thing inside the armor that has been running on combat stimulants and fear for 40 days and suddenly has nothing to run on, and you collapse. Not physically. You stay upright, you hold your weapon, you sit at your post. Something inside gives way and you feel it go, and you know it is not coming back. Men talked. That was the first thing that happened. A man in a transit barracks once asked me whether we turned on each other in those 5 days. He seemed to want us to have. We did not, and it was not because we were good men. Fighting requires a thing one man has and another wants. The taps were dry, the depot was residue, and there was no cache anywhere in that hive, because if there had been, we would all have known inside an hour. One working water point in that hive, and I would have a different story and would not be telling it. Men who had not spoken in days, men who had gone quiet and hard and inward, the way soldiers do when the pressure exceeds what speech can contain, suddenly started talking. Not about the war, not about the Tyranids, about home, about the worlds they came from, the people they had left, the jobs they had done before the Munitorum found them. Hanfeld, who was dead, and I keep forgetting he is dead. Hanfeld and his mother's porridge, 6 kinds of salt, each one at a different temperature. I used to find it maddening. On the second day of the silence, I would have given everything I owned, everything I had ever owned, to hear him tell me about salt one more time. Vesht talked about the docks on Immerbeck, the loading cranes, the way the cargo containers sounded when they were dropped on the stacking grid, a specific metallic ring that depended on whether the container was full or empty, and Vesht said he could tell within 5 kilograms what a container weighed by the sound it made when it landed, and I believed him because Vesht was the kind of man who knew one thing perfectly and did not bother with anything else, and the one thing he knew was containers. And containers had nothing to do with Tyranids, and that was the point. That was why he was talking about them, because for as long as he was talking about containers, he was not here. I talked about the transit depot on Immerbeck, the morning cycle smell, machine oil, grindstone dust, the labeling adhesive. I talked about Esivel, the administratum clerk with the laugh. I had spoken to her exactly twice. I talked about her for an hour, maybe 2. She is probably still at the depot, filing corrections, laughing at things that other clerks would report. And she does not know my name, and I know nothing about her beyond 5 letters on a name tag. And I talked about her for 2 hours to a dying man on a dead world, and that is the sort of thing fighting does to your priorities. On the 3rd day of silence, with nothing ahead of me but a slower version of the same ending, Esivel and her laugh were the only things I could think about that did not make me want to put my last gun in my mouth. I did not do that. Others did. I am not going to name them because they deserve better than being remembered for the last thing they did. And the last thing they did was a decision I understand, even if I did not make it. And I do not judge them for it. And if you judge them for it, then you have never sat in a dead hive, breathing dead air, with nothing in front of you but the long way round to the same place. Colonel Treskova died on the third day of the silence, not by her own hand. She walked to the wall, climbed to the parapet, and stood in full view of the Tyranid formation 2 kilometers out, and she stood there for 6 hours. I watched her for the first 2 because I noticed, because I always notice, and because I wanted to understand what she was doing up there. She was testing them. She was standing on the lip of a 90-meter wall in plain sight of an army that had been trying to kill her since before I landed, and nothing happened. Nothing. The warriors did not turn their crests toward her. The termagants did not raise their weapon arms. Not a single organism in that vast, silent formation reacted to the commander of Grenthar's last garrison, standing in the open at effective range. She was not worth a flesh-borer round. She was not worth the caloric expenditure of a single bio-bolt. The thing that had eaten 600 million people, the thing she had been fighting since before I arrived, could not be bothered to notice that she was there. She stood for 6 hours, and nothing looked at her, and then she sat down, and then she lay down, and by the time someone checked on her, she was dead, and the medic said dehydration and exposure and exhaustion. And I think the real cause of death was that she went up there looking for the enemy and found out she did not have one anymore. They put her body in the command bunker and covered it with a regimental standard, and someone said the Emperor's prayer, the same words we had been reciting on the wall when the Commissar died, and they sounded different now. On the wall, the words had been something to hold. In the silence, they were just sound, human sound in a place where human sound did not matter, and I said them anyway because I had been saying them for weeks, and stopping felt like giving up the last thing that was mine. And whether the Emperor heard them is a question that belongs to a better man than me. The words were not for him. They were for us. Day 44. Vesht came running, actually running, on no ration for 2 days and nothing but willpower left, and he came through the corridor and he was making a sound that took me a moment to identify as laughter. And he grabbed me by the webbing and pulled me to a window and pointed up. And I looked, and through the spore haze and the chemical murk and the death of everything, there were lights in the sky. Ships, imperial ships, not many. A transport, mid-class, the kind that carries a regiment, flanked by 4 escort vessels, frigates by their engine profiles, and they were in low orbit, maybe 300 kilometers up. And they were burning hard, and the running lights were the most beautiful things I had ever seen. More beautiful than Esivel's laugh. More beautiful than the morning cycle depot smell. More beautiful than anything that had existed before Grenthar ate the word beautiful and replaced it with hunger. The Vox crackled. A general frequency broadcast cutting through the interference. A voice that was calm and professional and completely detached from what was happening on the surface, the way only a naval officer can be detached. And the voice said, "This is His Majesty's vessel Unbowed Rampart. We are conducting an extraction operation under Subsector Velask, Contingency Order 9. All forces in Hive Drossenmarch are to proceed to the following coordinates for uplift. You have 90 minutes. I found out later what Contingency Order 9 is. It is not a rescue. It is a schedule. When a world goes to amber on a subsector chart, an order is cut assigning it one extraction pass at a fixed interval from the date of signature and from nothing else. Nobody aboard knew whether there was anyone left to lift. Nobody had heard from Treskova in 5 weeks, and nobody could have, because her choir was dead, and ours was dead, and the rift eats sendings the way the towers were eating the ground. A clerk in the Velask office signed a form before the situation was understood, and the Navy does not decline a valid order on the grounds that it has become pointless. 90 minutes was what the order said. 90 minutes. We had 90 minutes to get from the inner hive to a landing zone that was apparently on the northeastern industrial flats, the same area where we had landed 44 days ago, except now it was outside the hive wall in Tyranid-controlled territory, and we had to cross about 3 kilometers of consumed landscape to reach it. 90 minutes, on foot, through a dead city, with no food, no water, barely any ammunition, and a Tyranid army sitting in formation 2 kilometers from the wall. The thing about desperation is that it does not care about logistics. The thing about being told you have 90 minutes to live or die is that it overrides every calculation your body has been making about energy conservation and resource management and the careful rationing of effort that has been keeping you alive for the last 5 days. And it replaces all of that with a single imperative: move. 3 kilometers on foot in that time means walking wounded only. That is not an order anybody gave. Nobody stood up and announced it. It is what those 2 numbers mean together, and every man in that hive did the arithmetic inside about 4 seconds of the Vox going quiet. We had somewhere over 60 in the aid stations who could not stand. Amputations, gut wounds, a man from 4th Company blind since the 29th day. Carrying 1 means 2 men on the poles and 2 more to spell them, and 4 men at stretcher pace do not cross 3 kilometers of broken ground in 90 minutes. You have exchanged 5 living soldiers for 1 who was going to die anyway. I did not do that calculation. It does itself, and then sits in your head presenting the result while you put your webbing on. An orderly stayed, him and a woman whose name I never learned, on a stairwell landing 2 levels down, and the rest of us walked out past the door. I did not look in. Neither did anyone I was walking with. There was no discussion about it at any point from any quarter. The Munitorum has a phrase for men left in place during a withdrawal. The phrase is left in place. I have seen it on a form. So we moved. A trooper from the Planetary Defense Force was sitting against the corridor wall with his legs drawn up and his eyes open, and he was not moving, and I grabbed him by the webbing and pulled him upright, and he said, "Leave me." And I said no. And I do not know why I said no, because I did not owe him anything, and he was heavy, and I was weak, and dragging him cost me time I did not have. But I said no, and I dragged him, and he walked eventually, and he made it to the transport. And I never learned his name, and I do not need to. Every soldier who could still walk, and some who could not but found a way, got up and started moving toward the wall. And the wall was a boundary that had meant everything for 5 weeks, and now it was just a thing to climb over, and we climbed over it, and I stood on the other side for the first time since I had arrived, and the ground was gray, not brown. The brown had been alive. The gray was what was left. Bare mineral substrate, stripped of every organic molecule. And it was dry and fine, and it crunched under my boots the way ash crunches. And I was walking on the remains of a planet. Men around me were shaking. I could hear webbing rattling on the man in front of me the whole way out. Mine was not, and that is not courage. I have never once mistaken it for courage. The thing that broke on the first night stayed broken. I walked past a standing line of Tyranid warriors on a dead world with my hands perfectly steady, and I felt nothing about it at all, and the men who were shaking were the ones still in possession of the correct response. We were not the same number at the landing zone that we had been at the wall. I do not have a figure, and I would not trust one if I had it. But men stopped. That is the word for it. They did not fall, and they were not taken, and nothing came for them. They sat down on the gray and stayed sitting, and the ones nearest them shouted for a while, and then stopped shouting, because 90 minutes is 90 minutes, and the shouting was costing us meters. I dragged one man the whole distance because I got to him inside a corridor, where I had to step over him to keep walking. I walked past 4 more on the open ground, and did not slow down for any of them, and the only difference between the man I carried and the 4 I did not is that the 4 were not in my way. The Tyranids did not move. I keep coming back to that because it is the part I cannot reconcile. We walked past them, 400 and something human beings, stumbling across a dead landscape toward a landing zone, and the Tyranid organisms stood in formation and did not react. We passed within 800 meters of a line of warriors, and they watched us, and I use that word advisedly. They watched us, their heads tracking our movement the way a man tracks an insect on a wall. Idle attention, the kind of attention you give to something that is already accounted for, and they let us walk. A Munitorum officer explained it weeks later. The formations we walked past were not an army anymore. When a fleet finishes a world, it takes its organisms back because a hormagaunt is meat, and the fleet does not leave meat behind, and the synapse creatures go first because they are the expensive ones. I had watched what happens without them on the wall a month earlier and not understood it. Organisms near a warrior flanking like soldiers, organisms outside its range milling like animals. What we walked through was the outside of the range. All of it. Every one of them cut loose and waiting to be eaten by its own side. And 400 humans in the open did not rise to the level of a decision, because there was nothing out there left to make one. The transport was on the ground when we arrived, a big, ugly Imperial bulk lander sitting on a flat of gray ash with its ramp down and its engines running, and a loadmaster standing at the base of the ramp with a data slate, and the expression of a man who is doing his job and is going to keep doing his job, regardless of what is happening around him, because the job is the only thing that makes sense. He was checking manifest numbers. He was standing on a consumed planet, and he was checking manifest numbers, and I loved him for it. The manifest was procedure, and procedure was the most defiant thing available to a human being standing on that ground. He checked my number. He checked Vesht's number. He asked Vesht for his regiment. Vesht said, "You are standing on it." The loadmaster wrote something on the data slate and did not look up. He checked every number, and when he found people who were not on the manifest, he checked their numbers anyway and put them on the ramp anyway, because the transport was not full, and a loadmaster who turns away a living soldier to preserve the integrity of a document is a loadmaster who has forgotten what documents are for. Arriving off a condemned world without being on the list for it is not a small administrative matter. The ones he waved through went into the same quarantine we did and came out 3 weeks later, and none of them has ever said what happened in between. He saved their lives. Whether he did them a favor is a different question. We went up the ramp and we sat on the deck and the ramp closed, and the engines spooled up and the transport lifted. And I felt gravity shift and the deck shudder and the hull groan, and for the first time in 44 days, I was not touching Grenthar. From the air, through the hull porthole, I saw it, the whole of it, what Grenthar had become. Gray, everything gray. The hive walls of Drossenmarch standing in a sea of ash like a skeleton stripped clean, and the capillary towers rising above it all, 6 of them now, taller than anything the Imperium has ever built, biological spires reaching into the upper atmosphere and beyond, connected to the ground by a web of pulsing roots that covered the landscape like a circulatory system. The sky was not sky. It was a membrane, a living ceiling of spore matter and biological growth that connected the top of the towers to the hive fleet in orbit, and through it I could see shapes, vast shapes, the hive ships, and they were feeding. I could see them feeding, their proboscis structures extending downward into the tower tops and drawing the liquefied remains of a world up into their holds, and it was happening everywhere, across the entire visible surface, a planet-sized organism eating a planet. From orbit, it did not look like war. It did not look like invasion. It looked like nature, like something that was supposed to happen, like rainfall in reverse. The escort frigates were burning hard around us. I could see them through the porthole, 2 on each side, their engines at full military power, and their guns were firing, las batteries and macro cannon emplacements putting rounds into the void, and I could see what they were shooting at. Spore mines, floating biological munitions the size of HAB blocks, drifting in a loose field around the planet's orbit, and the frigates were clearing a path through them, detonating mines ahead of the transport's trajectory, and each detonation was a flash of chemical fire and a spray of organic shrapnel that pattered against the hull like rain. There were Tyranid void organisms. I could see them dimly through the haze, drone ships, escort-class bioforms, organic vessels that moved without engines through the debris field of a consumed world's former orbital infrastructure. They were not attacking. A few spore mines drifted toward the transport, and the frigates killed them. One drone ship changed course toward the convoy, and then changed course again, away, as if it had assessed the cost and decided against it. 2 frigates fell behind to cover the retreat, and I watched them through the porthole, getting smaller, and one of them took a hit from something I did not see, a biological torpedo or a spore mine that the point defense missed, and its starboard engine section vented atmosphere, and it started to list, and the other frigate moved to cover it, and then the transport entered the warp translation envelope, and the porthole went white, and I could not see them anymore. 2 frigates went into that orbit. I do not know if either of them came out. The naval officer who briefed us on the transport said the extraction was a standard contingency operation and that losses were within acceptable parameters, and I wanted to hit him, but I did not have the energy, and he was technically correct. 2 frigates for 400 soldiers. That was the exchange rate. That was what the Imperium was willing to spend to pull us off a dead world, and the reason it was willing to spend it was not compassion, and was not loyalty, and was not any of the things the primers say the Imperium values. It was data. We were being extracted because we had fought Tyranids and survived. And our combat logs and our after-action observations and the data in our heads was worth more than 2 frigates. And 2 frigates was worth more than 400 soldiers, and 400 soldiers was worth more than the 600 million people we had failed to save. And the arithmetic of it was exactly the sort of arithmetic the hive mind would have understood. They put us in quarantine on the transport, sealed section, lower decks, medical staff in containment suits, blood, tissue, lung function, neural response. They scanned us with instruments I did not recognize and talked to each other in language I was not educated enough to follow and did not want to be. The medical officer who examined me, a thin woman with steady hands and the emotionless efficiency of someone who has processed a lot of damaged bodies, told me that I had significant spore infiltration in my lungs, minor tissue degradation in my nasal passages, elevated cortisol levels, a back wound that had been closed and reopened often enough that she recorded it as a chronic rather than an injury, and what she described as unusual neural patterning in my sleep cycle baseline. And when I asked her what unusual neural patterning meant, she said it meant the patterns were unusual and that further observation was recommended, and that I should drink fluids and rest. I drank fluids. Clean water, actual clean water, from a dispenser that was not connected to a system that was being digested from the inside, and the taste of it, the absence of taste, the way it felt going down without the chemical burn and the organic residue and the faint undertone of something that used to be alive. I sat on the floor of the quarantine section, and I drank 3 liters of water, and I cried. And I am not ashamed of that either. Vesht was in quarantine with me. So were about 70 others from the 163rd, which meant that out of roughly 2,000 soldiers who had deployed to Grenthar, 70 had made it onto the transport. I did not ask about the rest of the regiment. I did not need to ask. The regiment was gone. The 163rd Immerbeck Line Infantry existed on a piece of paper in a Munitorum archive, somewhere and nowhere else. And eventually someone would update the paper, and then it would not exist there either. And 2,000 men and women would become a line in a ledger, a statistical entry in a subsector-wide casualty report, a data point in someone's analysis of Tyranid engagement outcomes. The debriefing was thorough. An intelligence officer, Munitorum classification, spent 4 hours asking me questions about the campaign, and there was a second man in the room who asked nothing at all for the first 3 hours and did not give a name or a rank, and whose rosette I saw exactly once when he reached across the table for the data slate and his coat moved. Nobody explained him, and I did not ask. He spoke twice. The first time he asked whether I had dreamed since the extraction, and the second time he asked whether anyone in my quarantine section had described the dreams as a room, and I said yes to both. And he wrote something down and went back to not existing. There was no right answer to either question, which I assume was the design. The questions from the Munitorum officer were not about heroism or sacrifice or any of the things you would expect a debriefing to cover. The questions were technical. What weapons were effective against which organisms and at what range? How quickly the Tyranid assault patterns adapted after a defensive tactic was employed? The interval between environmental changes? The spore saturation rate, the timeline of infrastructure failure, the specific organisms involved in the ammunition attacks, the composition and behavior of the tunnel assault formations. He wanted data. He wrote down everything I said in a notation system that looked like shorthand, and he did not react to any of it. Not to the underhive, not to the civilians, not to the silence, not to any of it. He had done this before. Same questions, same answers, into the same machinery that would issue the same recommendations to the next regiment sent to the next world. The machinery was as indifferent as the hive mind, and I did not like where that left either of them. He asked me at the end if I had anything to add. I said yes. The primers are wrong. Not inaccurate. Wrong. The primers treat Tyranids as an enemy. Something you fight, something you deploy against with a strategy and an objective and a reasonable expectation of outcome. And that framing is the most dangerous thing in the Imperial arsenal. More dangerous than a malfunctioning plasma gun, more dangerous than a commissar with a grudge, because it leads soldiers to believe that fighting Tyranids is fighting, and it is not. Fighting implies 2 parties in a contest. What happens on a consumed world is a process, and you are part of it, and it does not care whether you participate. You can delay. You cannot win. The primers should say so, and they will not, because the Imperium has no form for unwinnable. The intelligence officer wrote that down too. So did the other man who had been not existing in the corner for 4 hours, and who wrote for about as long as it took me to say it. It did not occur to me until the following morning that I had told a room containing a rosette that the Imperium's own instructional material was dangerous. Nothing came of it. A corporal's opinion on doctrine is beneath the threshold at which anything comes of anything, which is how everything else on Grenthar worked too. They kept us in quarantine for 9 days. On the 6th day, the unusual neural patterning resolved itself, which is a clinical way of saying the nightmares stopped. The dark room, the awareness, the sensation of being noticed and dismissed, all of it faded over the course of 3 sleep cycles until it was gone, and the absence of it felt like stepping out of a crowd, a sudden expansion of internal space, as if something that had been standing very close to me for 6 weeks had taken a step back, and then another, and then walked away entirely. And I lay on my cot in the quarantine section, and I stared at the ceiling, and I felt alone for the first time in 44 days, alone in my own head without the weight of something else's attention pressing against the inside of my skull. And the loneliness was the most exquisite relief I have ever experienced. Vesh stopped talking about containers after the nightmares ended. He went quiet again, the way he had been before Grenthar, the way I think he is naturally, a man of very few words who uses them carefully and does not waste them on things that do not require saying. On the 8th day of quarantine, he sat next to me in the mess section and ate a ration bar in silence, and then he said, without looking at me, "I can still feel where they were." I asked him what he meant. He said the ones outside the wall. When they stopped, I can still feel the direction they were standing in, like a compass bearing in my head, and it is getting fainter, but it is still there. My first reaction was not sympathy. It was to look at the ceiling and count the Vox pickups, of which there were 2 I could see in a sealed medical quarantine aboard a naval vessel carrying a man with a rosette who had asked me 4 days earlier whether anyone had described their dreams as a room. Vesh had just said into that, out loud, that he could feel the direction of a Xenos formation in his head. I did not change the subject. I did not tell him to be quiet. He was the last man alive who had known me before any of it. He tapped the side of his skull with one finger and looked at me, and I had nothing to say because I could feel it too. A residual awareness, not the hive mind, not the shadow, something smaller, something left behind, like the impression a heavy object leaves in soft ground after it has been removed. It faded. It took another week, maybe 2, but it faded, and by the time I was cleared for reassignment, I could not feel it anymore. Whether that means it is gone, or that I have stopped being able to detect it, is not a difference I intend to think about. They cleared us on the 9th day. Medical clearance, psychological clearance, combat readiness assessment. The psychological evaluation consisted of a single question. "Are you fit for duty?" I said yes. Every man and woman in the quarantine section said yes, because the alternative to yes was a munitorum holding facility for indefinite evaluation, and an indefinite munitorum holding facility is worse than combat in ways that I do not have time to explain, and you do not want me to explain. 391 soldiers survived the extraction from Grenthar. Of those, 312 were reassigned to existing formations within the subsector. 79, including me, were consolidated into a provisional company and attached to the 307th North Rifles as a replacement draft, which is a polite way of saying that the 307th had taken enough casualties in their own campaign that they needed warm bodies, and we were warm. And we were bodies, and the paperwork was simple. I received my new assignment on the transport deck, from a junior administratum clerk who handed me a data slate with the same enthusiasm you would hand someone a shopping list. And the data slate said I was to report to the 307th North Rifles at Marshalling Point, Caro Lodric 12, for immediate deployment to the Ianthavar Theater. And under the heading Combat Theater designation, it said, in small, neat type, Hive Fleet Activity, Tendril Sigma, more Tyranids, a different tendril, a different world, the same thing. The same thing that had consumed Grenthar was eating something else, somewhere else, and the Munitorum was sending me to stand in front of it again, because my record said I had survived a Tyranid engagement, and that made me experienced, which made me valuable, which made me the specific kind of appendable that the Departamento Munitorum prizes most, the kind that lasts slightly longer before expiring. Vesh got the same assignment. He looked at his data slate, and he looked at me, and he did not say anything, and I did not say anything, and there was nothing to say, and we both knew it. I can hear what is in all of this, that I felt something in my head for weeks after we came off that world, and that so did another man, and that I sat in a monitored compartment and let him say so out loud, that I noticed the underhive before anyone went down and kept it to myself, that I stood in a room with a rosette in it and told them their own primers were dangerous. Any one of those is a paragraph on a form. Together they are a shape, and I know what the shape looks like because I have watched this Imperium decide what things were from a lot less than that. I am saying it anyway, and the reason is smaller than I would like. Not courage. I am 2 days out from a world with a Hive fleet on it, and my odds of being alive in 6 weeks are not good enough for a denunciation to reach me first. The Munitorum is slow, and the Tendril is not. That is a gap wide enough to put an account like this into. I think about Grenthar every day, the way my hands clench and unclench, whether I approve or not. I think about the wall. I think about the silence. I think about Corvan foring with one arm braced against the rockcrete, and Vesht walking up to the pinned warrior and emptying his cell into its neck, and Colonel Treskova standing on the parapet for 6 hours, looking at the thing that had eaten her world, and the loadmaster checking manifest numbers on a consumed planet, and the 2 frigates falling behind to cover the transport, and the Tyranids watching us leave with the idle attention of something that has finished eating and is watching the crumbs blow away. The dark room comes back most, the awareness, the weight of being noticed by something so vast that the noticing itself felt like gravity, and the dismissal. That is the worst thing that happened to us on Grenthar. Not the fighting, not the dying. Being weighed by an alien intelligence and found insufficient. We did not survive because we fought well. We survived because we were too small to bother with. That is what fighting Tyranids does. It does not kill you. It makes you irrelevant, and then it lets you live with that. The transport is 2 days from Ianthavar. I can see the planet from the observation deck, a blue-green dot that looks alive, that looks like a world where things grow and people live and the air is breathable and the water is clean. It looks like Grenthar looked once, before the Hive fleet found it. It looks like every world looks before. I have cleaned my last gun. I have checked my ammunition. I have 4 power cells, standard issue, 240 shots. Against Tyranids, that is nothing. But it is what I have, and there is a ramp in my future and a world on the other side of it. And whatever is waiting on that world is waiting whether I am ready or not. Corporal Hadren Mossik, Provisional Company, 307th North Rifles, deploying to Ianthavar Theater, Hive Fleet Activity, Tendril Sigma. Emperor, protect us, because nothing else is going to.